everyone to our Tuesday edition of the Writers and Readers series here at Rosemont College, part of the Rosemont Writers Retreat. I'm very happy to welcome Gregory Frost, someone who I've had the pleasure of knowing for quite some time, admire his work as a writer and also as a teacher. I love talking to Greg. He brings out the nerd in me, and it's the best. So please welcome Greg Frost.
Thank you.
Primarily write fantasy and horror, which I know I'm not supposed to call it horror, but I know you call it horror sometimes. So thrillers.
Usually in the middle of it.
The horror.
The
Anyway.
horror, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, and I know you've done more than one adaptation of classic tale, and yeah. I'm just sort of wondering how you decide on the themes.
Well, to answer that on a larger scale, my response would be if you said, when do you think about theme or whatever? Mm-hmm. Pretty much like Tawny's answer yesterday, which is I start with characters and the situation, and theme emerges from it. I think if you're a writer worth your salt, no matter what you start writing, you're going to find things emerging out of the work.
Okay. So does gender or popular culture or politics play any role in your subject matter or your work?
Sure. If I'm writing a science fiction story, for instance, I think by definition all science fiction is political. Mm-hmm. It has to be, whether you like it or not, whether you think you're writing a political story. You are, because you've extrapolated from the world we live in, and you've had to make decisions about what direction that world went, if you will. So it's invariably political. It's saying something about the way people behave, people treat each other, that sort of thing. Horror fiction, on the other hand, even though the term is still in disrepute and it's the publishing industry's fault, is really the fiction of invasion. It's the fiction of violation. So there's sort of a political and a sexual and a sociological side to horror fiction if it's done well, because that's what it's talking about, is things coming in, so to speak. And it's talking about things in a couched manner that usually stand for something else. This is the first chapter from part one of the book, which is called True Thomas. You understand? Onku asked, and Thomas realized suddenly that his brother had been speaking to him. He looked up, mouth agape, lips slack as a drunkard's. He squinted. What was Onku saying? He pushed dirty fingers through his unkempt hair, shook his shaggy head. God, he's gormless. Baldy laughed. Onku shushed him and tried again. You stay here now, Tommy. It's dry and you can sleep in the grass while we fish upriver, right? Thomas took in the tall, reedy grass around him, the glimmering of the river ahead. Then he twisted around to see the trees behind him, black alders. He knew where he was, knew they had come here from home, the route Onku, Baldy, and he always took, though the specifics of the journey itself eluded him. So many things eluded him. They'd been walking in any way he wasn't allowed on a horse. He closed his eyes, saw his feet plodding along a path. The weight of his brother's hand pressed down on his shoulder. Set, Onku ordered, and he opened his eyes again. The memory slipped away like a minnow. Thomas Lindsay Rymor de Erseldun, half-witted 14-year-old son of a locally powerful family, did as he was bade and squatted down in the grass. He was lean and black-haired, and his fierce blue eyes could pin you sharp as blades if you could get him to focus on you for longer than an instant. Had it not been for the fits that plagued him and the simpleness of his mind, he might have been a fine catch for most any girl in Erseldun. The trouble was, everyone in the town and for miles around knew of his peculiarities. Some thought him possessed, others were certain he was touched by God, and that the things he blathered while rolling about and foaming fiercely were true prophecies. Weren't the Sibyls of ancient days similarly cursed? And Taliesin as well? Opinions of this varied widely and were often voiced over tankards of ale. Those closest to him, his father, even his mother privately, and definitely his younger brother, believed him to be an idiot. He sat cross-legged among the reeds. "Hey-o," Baldy said, "there's a relief." His thick mouth smirked beneath a nose bent crooked ever since the first time they brought the idiot with them. That morning Thomas had been seized by a fit, fallen face first into the Ettrick River, and would have drowned if Baldy hadn't waded in and grabbed hold of him. But Thomas, unaware of everything, had flapped and windmilled and swung his head wildly back, cracking the bridge of Baldy's nose, getting himself dumped face down in the river again, until Ankou hauled him out. Baldy, cursing, spitting, wouldn't touch him again for all the treasures of the Fae. There were no fish caught that morning. Spluttering Thomas had scared them off. When Ankou had flung him out onto dry land, he'd rolled about and babbled, "The teeth of the sheep will lay the plough to rest," and then fallen quiet and still. As his predictions went, it made about as much sense as any. Since then, Baldy had given him a wide berth. If he'd set himself on fire now, Baldy would only have nodded in appreciation, but from a respectful distance. "You don't follow us now," Ankou told Thomas. "You stay here and sleep till the sun's down. Or, I don't know, count the leaves on the black alder there." Thomas tilted back his head and looked at the nearest tree upside down. 2,968, he said. "Leave him already," Baldy called. Boots off, he was wading into the water, hissing at every plashing step from one big and precarious stone to another. "Christ, Ankou cursed. "Then count the damn catkins or something." 87. "I could see more if I were standing." He started to sit up. "Well, you're not. Lie back. Count birds flying over. Count clouds. Till we come get you." He did as he was told and stared into the sky, all but forgetting that Ankou was there. "Come on," insisted Baldy. "It's fucking cold and I'm not going to stand here till my balls crawl up inside me." Thomas heard Ankou laughing, tug off his boots and wade out after his friend. Baldy, plump and generous, though he'd never admit it, but Thomas knew him, saw him true. Heard them on the far bank then, Baldy chattering about the harvest. Their voices faded into the world, where birds sang songs, no two alike, a conversation he could very nearly understand as he tracked it back and forth, and the reeds sizzled now, waving accompanied by breezes, and thoughts jittered and split and swarmed. Every moment took him off somewhere. He hardly noticed when the sounds and sensations of the whole world absorbed his brother and Baldy like soil soaking up rain. Time isolated him from before and after, cause and effect, sealed him off from human communication, from meaning. It could be sunrise one moment and night the next. Such discontinuity was just how the world was to Thomas. He was quite used to losing most of it. What was lost wasn't important, wasn't noticed. After a while, he tilted his head back again. 207 catkins, he said of a goat willow, larger than my fingers. He held up his hand to study those fingers. Dirt encrusted the broken nails. The sun was hanging to the west now. Afternoon had arrived, new shadows, different lines, angles and slices out of the light. He held his hand up, placing it over the sun. The edges of his fingers glowed red-orange, and he smiled. A breeze blew, and the reeds hissed all around him. A scent rode on the breeze, alien to him. It drew his attention away from admiring his glowing fingers. He recalled every smell ever, though many had no name and simply came with images, moments cut out of a dark dough and scattered. This one was new, strangely sweet, like wildflower honey. At that moment the sun went into eclipse, or had it begun to set? His hand was just his hand again, held up against darkness. He lowered it. A strange shape sat upon a beast right beside him. Silhouetted black against the sun, the shape seemed to have two heads. He squinted, but that didn't help. Odd spikes festooned the figure and the horse it rode, but he saw immediately that it wasn't a horse. It had a snout too long and too sharp, though it pawed the ground, impatient as a horse. It carried its rider out of the sun's way, and brightness flared into his eyes again, making them tear up. The air tinkled musically. The sweetness enveloped him, and the bees making it buzzed within his brain, realigning his thoughts. Thomas sat up, wiped at his eyes, streaking dirt across his cheek like some warrior picked preparing for battle. Peering down upon him was the most extraordinary woman he'd ever seen. She wore a green cape, the hood laid back to reveal her resplendent red hair beneath a pointed cap. The beast was revealed now to be a stallion of pure white, bedecked in a fine blue and gold caparison. How had he seen it differently? He had also observed him coolly, but he hardly noticed that. The second head belonged to Ankou, who was seated behind the woman on the stallion. His expression was as dull as if he was asleep with his eyes open. Anku changed his mind about fishing with Baldy, Thomas said aloud, without noticing. Why? Something like invisible fingers seemed to prod and push at his head, creating a pressure not unlike what he felt just before a fit struck. But no fit overwhelmed him, and the bees buzzed again. Majesty, said a deep voice. Thomas followed it to a retinue of 2 men on their own horses behind her, knights in black armor. They had plainly all crossed the river together. Shall we? No, she answered. Look at him. Poor broken toy. Such a pretty one, too. What a waste. Not even worth consuming. Odd that her cherry lips didn't move as she spoke, though the words rang in his head, clear as New Year's bells. The Queen of Heaven, he thought, but could not remember where he had heard the title. Was it a song? Wasn't someone playing a hurdy-gurdy? She smiled at it with the magnanimous pity of a monarch. And in that smile lay her decision that would change her world and his in ways unimaginable. She leaned down and brushed her hand across his face. Her blood-dark nails traced his forehead. His whirling, buzzing thoughts slowed, stilled. For the first time in his life, he experienced a silence in himself. Anku changed his mind about shh. The lady shushed him with the sound of the reeds, urged him to lie back in the grass again and sleep. To her retinue she said, "This one will forget we passed. I've snatched his puzzle thoughts." He did lie back as commanded, but neither slept nor forgot. He could see in his mind the 50 silver bells woven into the horse's mane and the 12 stars along the reins, the way the shining barding across the horse's forelock poked up as if the horse had horns, just as he could see the odd gold shape of her eyes, which made him think of both buttons and spiders, the way her pupils seemed like pinpricks around her bright irises. She pulsated with desire. He wanted to go with Anku. The bells tinkled as she rode off. The other 2 passed beside him, and like her, they each crossed the ball of the sun, and as they did, they changed. Spines as sharp and polished as thorns projected from their silhouettes, their mouths became fanged, and the beasts upon which they were seated turned into things carved from dark skeletons, but not of horses. He had never seen anything like them, and was too awed to be terrified. Close by came the riders' thoughts. They wanted to kill him, and did not care that he saw their true nature. But their queen had been clear in her command, and they passed him by, becoming men and horses again. He watched them, upside down, riding toward the black alder until the swishing tall grass hid them. He lay still a while longer, wondering about things, his thoughts assembling in ways new to him, in orderly patterns. The great roar of the world had quieted for the first time in his life, letting him perceive his thoughts before he spoke them. Eventually he arrived at a troubling question that brought him to his feet. Why hadn't Baldy been with them too? By what new instinct he couldn't say, Thomas walked down to the strand of pebbles and small rocks where his brother and Baldy had crossed the river. The big stepping stones out in the water led to a path up the opposite bank. They always fished in the same spot, across the peninsula of woodland. As he stood there, a long wooden pole swept past. Pulled along by the current, it clacked against the stones in the middle of the stream, rotated and slid between them. It was unmistakably Anku's dapping pole, tied with strips of leather at the handle and the juncture in the middle. Floating along the river as if in pursuit of it came a bundle of rags, but soon enough he identified a forearm, the back of a head, legs. The rags became a body. He waded in. It was icy cold, the water. He jumped from stone to stone to intercept the body as it floated up past him. And he squatted, grabbed onto a sleeve and tugged. Baldy rolled over like a log. Face up, his blank eyes stared wide as if beholding something terrible in the sky. There was no wound, no blood. But sodden and heavy, he was too much for Thomas, and the current had its way, prying the body from his chilled fingers into the main channel and dragging Thomas in with it. He splashed, choked, hammered the surface with his arms, finally clutched onto the big stone again and pulled himself back to safety. By the time he could look, Baldy was well down the river, a flowing clutch of rags again. Thomas managed to work from stone to stone and finally washed himself up on the pebbly strand. crawled out and lay, gasping. Pressure filled his head again. Streaks of lightning fractured his sight. He heard his voice as he always did, as if it belonged to another. A time for hell. They arrive, they take, all green with the enchantment. He mewed and rocked on the strand. Unlike every riddle he had ever babbled before, this one opened to him like a flower. His thoughts quieted, coalesced around it. The knights had killed Baldy to take Ankou. But why? And where were they going? No war hereabouts, no fighting, no village, no habitation on that path in that direction either. Only the abbey, and they were no monks. They arrive, they take. 50 bird calls trilled on the wind like tinkling bells. Thomas jumped to his feet and ran.